Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Gosh, I've never known a room go quiet so quickly. Wonderful. Welcome, good afternoon. It's a very great pleasure to have so many of you here for this panel discussion on setting a post-2020 biodiversity agenda, the Communications Challenge. And in the name Post-2020 Biodiversity Agenda, you can see we already have a communications challenge. It's great to have such a wonderful and distinguished panel and audience, and I think we're going to have a really exciting afternoon. My name is Mike Rands. I'm the director of the Cambridge Conservation Initiative, which is a collaboration between the 10 organisations whose logos you can see along the top line of that vast number of organisations there. It's a collaboration designed to try and bring research, policy, practice and capacity development together to make the world a better place for biodiversity and indeed for all life on Earth. 2020 is an incredibly important year for the future of life on Earth. Governments from all over the world will be meeting in Beijing to formulate a framework and adopt a framework indeed to succeed the current strategy for biodiversity and the actual biodiversity targets. For those who are involved in efforts to make our natural world flourish, this will be a new plan, and potentially we hope very much that the Beijing meeting will be as significant, if not more so, than the Paris Climate Agreement was. 2020 feels a long way off. It's over 1,000 days away, but already a lot of planning and work has been underway in preparation for that meeting, and you will hear about that in a few minutes. Science and evidence will be absolutely crucial to the development and implementation of that new framework, and for the last 3 days we have had a group of experts from all over the world meeting here in the David Attenborough building to put some of that evidence together, to explore it, to work out how best it can be shared and used in order to develop that post-2020 framework. However, there's no doubt in all our minds that science, natural science, social science, knowledge, evidence is not enough for such a new framework. The key is how do we communicate the values of life on Earth to the rest of society so that they value it in the same way as many of the conservation community do at the moment. And that's our challenge, and that's what we are going to be talking about today. In order to give you a snapshot of those the last couple of days and what we've been doing, I'm delighted to invite Professor William Sutherland, the Miriam Rothschild Professor of Conservation Biology here at the university, and also the chair of the Cambridge Conservation Initiative at the moment, to give you a flavour of what we've been doing here. Bill.
Thanks, Mike. I'm delighted to be here. I'm the warm-up act. So we're here as conservationists. We're responsible for the problem that biodiversity loss is one of the greatest issues facing humanity. And if you're serious, you have a convention. So those working on drugs or corruption or the ozone layer or desertification or climate have their own convention. And we are serious, so we do. We have the Convention on Biological Diversity. And it was first signed in 1992 by 150 world leaders in Rio de Janeiro, and it's famous as the largest group of world leaders together at one time ever. It was a big thing. They all came together, the largest number in one place at one time. Remarkable. And they created a plan. And that plan has done good. It's resulted in actions around the world that have improved the planet, that have restored habitats, that have protected habitats. It's great. However, it's widely accepted that the results are variable, and it hasn't actually delivered on a global scale. So, as Mike says, it's up for reconsideration in 2020. We need to do it better, and that is what all of it's about. So we've been meeting for the last 3 days to consider the evidence needed for the convention to function and needed to deliver on the actions afterwards. We worked, first of all, by having a very detailed, extensive review of the evidence needs, the critical building blocks, and then there's been a remarkable meeting of 50 high-level government negotiators, NGO representatives, academics coming together from 20 countries in order to review that material. So they've sort of been acting as peer reviewers, as critical friends. They've been identifying where the review has it right, where the review has it wrong, where they disagree, where there are opportunities for further work, and especially where there are new ideas and new opportunities. So the document's been mauled and restructured, but once reworked, it'll provide a great resource for underpinning the discussions for the 2020 meeting and the stages that build up, critically a meeting in Montreal in July. So there's a 60-page document. We've had 20 working group meetings, great mass of ideas. I can't possibly review, unless I could have another few hours, all of the material. So we've had lots of nerdy discussions, but I'm just going to give 5 examples. First, we had detailed technical discussions about targets. That's how you deliver on the objectives. But the details of the target really matter. You need the right number, the right specificity in order for it to work. Most famously, Chairman Mao set a target that everyone had to kill 5 flies a day, which was very successful, but lots of people started breeding flies in order they could achieve that objective. So not quite right. So policymakers also don't want to report failures, so they want vague targets that they can achieve. But in order to deliver, you want specific targets. So how do we balance that in order to get that right? Or the detail of delivery, that really matters. So exemplary examples are Tony Blair's decision to embed Nick Stern, the climate economist, in the Treasury, and that had huge impacts. Or the Brazilian president taking control over climate change and forcing that through the state decision-making processes. Or the mainstreaming of biodiversity in Mexico. So we need to be looking at those examples of delivery, how that works, and how we can learn from that, because that's critical. The test of targets is monitoring. We really care how that is done. How do we design that? That was a key gap last time. The whole issue of monitoring and to show that you've done it was done too late. We need new ways of doing that. And then finally, the communication challenge is critical. Hence today's meeting, and we've got another meeting tomorrow to discuss how we're going to do that. How do we get biodiversity into the heart, soul, and pocket of everyone? That's a quote from Sasha Shestakov, who I saw somewhere over here. I've largely quoted him. The second quote he has, is a great source of quotes, is, "The next generation will remember us for what we did, not what we planned." So we need a good plan, but we need to actually deliver on it for that to make a difference. So the challenge is not only to ensure we get the right plan, but we find the process for converting that into action. So the main objective, maintain the momentum, so to create a better plan and to ensure that's delivered, whether by governments or business or civil society or NGOs or academics, that they have the capacity to deliver. So it's going to be a busy 12 to 15 months before the 2020 meeting is all set up. And I'm delighted that CCI has been able to play a role in hosting this and playing a role in this critical adventure. I look forward to an improved planet. I also look forward to hearing now about the best means of communicating these critical messages. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bill. I didn't envy you trying to summarize those last 3 days, but you did a wonderful job. Thank you very much. It's now a very great pleasure to introduce Christiana Pascoe, who is the Executive Secretary of the Convention on Biological Diversity. Christiana has the extraordinary challenge to lead the process with many governments to develop the framework we have talked about already, and she comes with a superb track record for doing so. She was Romania's Minister for Environment, Water and Forests. She negotiated on behalf of Romania the Paris Climate Agreement, and she has worked for the European Union, the World Bank and many other organisations, including, I'm pleased to say, starting her career possibly with Fauna and Flora International, one of the CCI partners. So welcome and thank you very much, Christiana, for coming.
Can I speak directly in this?
Yes.
And which one do I use here? Okay. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you very much. It's a great, great honor for me to be here. Indeed, last time I was in Cambridge was 20 years ago when I was Romania's country director for FFI, and I remember those days with great pleasure because it was a time when I was really doing biodiversity in the field. We were setting up the first national parks in Romania after the fall of communism, and I was very excited as a young scientist to be part of that. Let me first start by thanking Cambridge Conservation Initiative for giving me and my team here the opportunity to speak to you today, and also to say that I'm extraordinarily honored to be in Sir David Attenborough's building and to meet him personally. He's one of my heroes, and I have great admiration for everything that he has done for this critical agenda. For me, growing up in the 70s and 80s behind the Iron Curtain in a communist regime, I didn't have a chance to watch his beautiful documentaries. At the time, it was just Jacques-Yves Cousteau that was shown on TV, and that was my inspiration to go on this path. But I'm happy to have the opportunity to meet today with Sir David as well. So, sorry, do I use this one or this?
This one.
This one.
The arrow here.
The arrow. All right. So what I thought I would do today, because already the scene was set a little bit to discuss about post-2020 and what's the plan or what's the strategy or what's the framework and how are we going to turn the Titanic away from hitting the iceberg, because I think that's where we are. And we only have 2 years, which is like tomorrow, to perhaps engage on a different path. What I wanted to share with you is just some thoughts and ideas emerging from various consultation processes that we had with experts like yourselves, but also with some of our parties. As you know, the Biodiversity Convention has nearly universal UN membership. There are 196 countries, so there is a lot of excitement about that. So it's just ideas that hopefully will get further reflection in the coming years as we come closer to the China moment. So this year, in 2018, our very dear convention, the Convention on Biological Diversity, celebrates 25 years since its entry into force. It was mentioned, it was adopted in Rio together with the Climate Change and the Desertification Convention, our sisters Rio conventions. And a lot has been achieved in these 25 years. We look with pride at this period of time. And we had a plethora of strategies and plans and actions and political engagements. And truly, I started in this field in 1992. I was a student at the time, right after the fall of communism in Romania. So I can say that in 25 years, I think there was a lot of progress also in terms of awareness and perhaps also mind change when it comes to biodiversity. So if we are judging by these kind of actions, and of course in the Biodiversity Convention we had the strategic plan, the current one up to 2020, we have the 20 global global biodiversity targets, the Aichi targets, a lot. So one could say that we have made a lot of progress. If we are, however, measuring our progress and success by what the science tells us about the status of nature and biodiversity, here are two graphs that we included in some of the documents that we discussed in our technical bodies. And as you can see, the projections look very grim. By 2050, under a business as usual scenario, the decline is massive. So this is the reality. I think, sometimes governments, and I speak here also from my little hat as a former cabinet member, even in the international community, we are very proud when we manage to negotiate an agreement where we tap ourselves on the back and say, fantastic, we got all these countries to agree on this plan. But is that enough? Do we stop there? Because in reality, if none of that gets translated into actions that make a difference, this is what we end up having. So I'm not going to go into further details, but just to give you that perspective. So if that's where we are, let me add to that other global dynamics, because together with my team and in these consultation meetings that we had also with our parties, we have to acknowledge that the world is changing very, very rapidly, and we are looking at a time scale to 2050. So we need to be aware of all the other dynamics affecting our agenda and see how we can operate in that very complex system. So if we look at risks, this is coming from the World Economic Forum's Global Risk Report of last year. It was presented in Davos in January, and I had the pleasure to be there. And as you can see in the top quadrant, top right quadrant, where the most dangerous risks are, the green squares are the environmental ones, and that's where they're all clustered. And it is also for the first time, if you see, that's not helping me. Biodiversity loss and ecosystems collapse, it's making it into this global risk for the first time. And I think this is a big wake-up call for the global community. Just some ranking in terms of risks that will have the biggest impact in the next years. As you can see, natural disasters, climate change mitigation, adaptation, water crisis, all of them, of course, are connected also with biodiversity and ecosystems. The risks most likely to happen in the next 10 years, very similar picture. And this is one of my favorite because it talks about the complex interlinkages between these various types of risks. And biodiversity is not a silo problem in itself. You see, top one, biodiversity loss and ecosystem collapse linked to food crisis, extreme weather events, failure of climate mitigation and adaptation, and so on and so forth. The complexity of all the interlinkages between these various risks. And then we have the fourth industrial revolution, all over us, if I may say so, with rapid developments, and some of them unregulated. In the UN and the convention, the professor earlier was saying, if we are serious, we have a convention. Yes, we have a convention, but it's also a process that is sometimes slow and cumbersome moving forward, and not keeping pace with the fast speed of these developments. So artificial intelligence, robotics, biotechnologies, there are great opportunities in some of these developments, but also some great risks, some that we may not be yet aware of, and clearly perhaps not trying to regulate. I wanted to put this slide because maybe many of you know, or some of you don't know, the Convention on Biological Diversity, it's not just about conservation. In fact, we are a Sustainable Development Convention, not an environmental conservation convention. The first objective is indeed conservation of biodiversity, but the second is sustainable use of this resource, and the third is the equitable sharing of the benefits arising from the genetic resources. So we also have two protocols, the Nagoya Protocol on access and benefit sharing, and the Cartagena Protocol on biosafety. Synthetic biology, things like Earth genome decoding are topics that are discussed under our convention. But again, it's a fact that I think it's less known publicly. What I wanted to illustrate here is the rapid change in biotechnology. It used to take about 20 years from developing a first modified organism in a lab until it became commercial. In this recent time, so in the last 5 to 6 years from 2012, when we had this new tool, the CRISPR, we could see in just 4 years the turnaround from the lab into production. And I think moving forward, these timescales will collapse further and further. Again, there might be great opportunities there, and here are some of them, in terms of what the fourth industrial revolution can and technologies can bring to our agenda, and some great risks that we need to be aware of and account for. Again, I'm not going to go into details, but I think at the end of the day, maybe even from a philosophical standpoint, one question we need to ask as a global community is who gains, who loses, and who are we? What do we want? How do we want this world to look like 20, 30, 50 years from now? So now with that in mind, kind of zooming in biodiversity, zooming out on the kind of global, bigger picture, global dynamics, we asked ourselves, how do we think about post-2020, given this context? So I think we have the luxury to build on these 25 years of great work under CBD and on the current strategic plan, which has a beautiful vision by 2050. And that's already set in the text of the convention. And that's by 2050, biodiversity is valued, conserved, restored, and wisely used, maintaining ecosystem services, sustaining a healthy planet, and delivering benefits essential for all people. Now, this is a beautiful vision, living in harmony with nature. But I think one could also ask, but what does it mean to live in harmony with nature by 2050? The projections are that we will be 9 billion people by 2050. How are they going to live in harmony with nature? We had, again, in some of the convention work, and this is coming from a paper that we prepared for our parties, on various scenarios, how do we bend the curve? So the curve of destruction, biodiversity loss by 2050, how do we turn that around? And there are several scenarios, all involving a packaging of different measures. So I think there is a note of optimism here in the sense that even though overall the picture looks pretty bad, there is hope that with the right action, with a real focus on the right measures and on implementation, we can perhaps turn the tide. So global technology is one of the scenarios, decentralized solution, consumption change, very important, and in various colors here you have the mix. But then what I wanted to also bring into the discussion is this whole perspective from transition frameworks. This is coming from some of the work in Holland that some Dutch scientists are doing at the Dutch Research Institute for Transitions, DRIFT, whereby we look how can we transition socio-ecological economic systems to a different equilibrium point where perhaps we can reach that living in harmony with nature. So we worked with them and we invited them into our meetings to just give this almost theoretical, conceptual way of framing things. I don't have a laser beam here, but if you look at the first graph on the left, the little micro niches, so that's where innovation and disruption happens at the niche level. And then what you want is for those to kind of start moving up to a middle level, and then at the top to become mainstream in the landscape. I think if we use that analogy, and then the second graph, it's showing the scale on a timeline of the transition. But if we look at the first one, I think we can say that in the CBD space, the community, the conservation community, or all the stakeholders together in this arena, we see a lot of innovation in niche spaces, including the fact that in Mexico at our last COP, and our Mexican representative is here, we discussed for the first time mainstreaming biodiversity into economic sectors such as agriculture, fisheries, tourism, and forest. And in Egypt, at the end of this year, where we will have our next convention, the subject will be mainstreaming biodiversity into energy, infrastructure, mining, oil and gas, manufacturing, and health. So with that, we pretty much cover, I think, most important sectors of an economy. I think, you know, if we would make this mainstreaming really real at the landscape level, then, you know, the change that I would like to see, for example, would be in a cabinet discussion when the Minister of Environment is proposing some budget allocation for, you know, natural capital accounting or something. The Minister of Finance would say, oh yes, absolutely, we have to do that, that's so important. And not how it happens nowadays. Often it's like, what are you talking about? You know, we have other priorities, so give us a break with the butterflies and the elephants and all that. That's why yeah, I mean, some examples of how this transition happened, you know, the fossil fuel, it's classical, moving into renewable, moving into solar. And we see in the beginning, it's, you know, it's the innovators and the disruptors that are starting the movement. And then you see an acceleration and moving to a new equilibrium. So hopefully, some of that will happen in the biodiversity regime as well. What is a biodiversity regime? Many things, but what we got from the discussion with these researchers is that, in fact, perhaps so far, we have been focusing a lot our policy, processes, and science aiming at decreasing biodiversity loss instead of addressing the root causes. So I think we are still not addressing the root causes of the destruction that we are seeing, and as many of you know, those root causes are in the economic models and the economic development models. So the way forward is to engage with new ideas and these niches and recombine core strengths to move the whole system. We are talking about this a transition and a transformation at the whole system level. So what would biodiversity transition mean? It would mean perhaps a way is taking place in the way we understand, organize, and practice biodiversity protection, conservation, and regeneration, affects the way biodiversity is communicated. So, you know, this workshop also today and tomorrow will focus a lot on the communication aspect. And is driven by broader landscape changes, digitalization, technological change, for our economic and demographic changes. Hold on, sorry, there was one here. Yeah. This is another conceptual way of looking at it, the X curve, but I'm going to go directly to this one. Because in the space of transition, we can start at the top by looking at what structures need to change in a top-down. And we already mentioned the root causes, the economic models, the economic conditions, the institutions and interests, the roles and responsibilities. So these have to change top-down. What we need to build up from the bottom up is new lifestyle, new practices, new capacities, new networks. What is not working, we have to let go of. And these are interests, infrastructure, practices, fossil fuel subsidies, and things like that. And then what is the vision for the future? What is the end goal? What are we aiming to achieve? And we are aiming to achieve to live in harmony with nature within the planetary boundaries while having 9 billion people having a decent lifestyle as well. Not a small challenge. So again, now equipped with all these concepts and ideas, we come back to our UN processes, the convention processes, and not only the convention processes, but all the other stakeholders outside the convention. And we try to think how do we reflect all this in the post-2020? A helpful way to do that is what's called the visioning and backcasting exercise. So we can start at point 1, where we want to be in 2050, living in harmony with nature. Describe the vision and the ambition. We have you have the text, right? Living in harmony with nature, but how do we measure that? How do we know if we achieve that or not? Again, with 9 billion people. And once that vision is defined, walk backwards and create pathways with milestones on the road and formulate very concrete actions to get there. So in a way, it's a long-term visioning and a short-term actioning. Some principles to think about that, because with that in mind, we were thinking that perhaps the post-2020 should not be just a plan for the next decade, 2020 to 2030, but should actually be a plan for the 3-decade by 2050. And I'll come back to that. But what are the principles? Because again, the world is changing super fast. So we need to be flexible and adaptive and allow for adjustments based on the global dynamics. We need action-oriented leadership. I think it's enough of talking, enough of strategizing. We really need action, and we really need implementation. And that's a lot more that has to be done in that space. We have to be mindful of the different contexts and inequalities and inequities and different swimming lanes. The swimming lanes are these ones, the lines going from the concrete action to the big vision. Not all of us, or not all stakeholders, would be following the same swimming path. So that has to be accounted for. I think we, of course, have to dream and vision, but we have to be very pragmatic and very realistic about what's happening in the real world. And if you allow me, maybe I'll comment more in the panel discussion, because I've seen this from both being a little scientist at the beginning of my career, and then having an international donor hat, and then a cabinet member. When you are in the politics and the cabinet member, there is a big disconnect between the values and the importance and the priorities there versus what the science community would consider it's a big priority. So we need to be able to bridge those two. Innovation and creativity, absolutely, without completely thinking outside of the box and disrupting, I don't think we'll make it. So now, what could be building blocks for a Nature Agenda 2050? And again, these are ideas emerging from these various discussions. Maybe these ideas would make it into the final document that will be adopted in China, maybe not. But this is where we are now with all these sort of brainstorming exercises. So I want to start here with let's imagine, remember that S-curve and the graph. Close your eyes and imagine where we are in 2050. And let's imagine, how do we want nature to look like in 2050? Or not how do we want, but how would nature look like in 2050? What's the experience of somebody born today or in the next 10 years going to be? How would they experience nature in 2050 versus how we experience it today, or versus how our grandparents experienced it 20 years ago? And by the way, I think when we talk about this, we focus a lot on humans, I find. I find it's a very anthropocentric view. In a lot of the documents, we talk about saving biodiversity to ensure human well-being, or human decent living. How is nature going to interact with us? It's something that we ask less. And the fact that this is a space for all forms of life, not just for the dominant species. But, if by 2050 we aim to live in harmony with nature, 9 billion people here, and having a decent life, eradicating poverty, and all the other wonderful goals that we have in the Sustainable Development Agenda, then perhaps what we could think of is, okay, define much more clearly how do we measure, what's the indicator, what are the targets in 2050 that we want to achieve, and then walk backwards the way we we did in the backcasting exercise, to have decade by decade a very concrete action plan that is implementable. So then in a decade 2020 to 2030, 30 to 40, 40 to 50. You see some percentages there, and I'll come back to that to explain what they are. So if the long vision is 2050, then what would need to happen or would be good to happen in the first decade, 2020 to 2030? So we call that action plan 2020 to 2030 to focus on the action word and not on strategizing or frameworking or whatever. Science-based targets. Whatever targets we come up with, I think it's absolutely imperious that they are founded and deeply rooted in solid science. So we also, of course, have the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Agreement and other international frameworks under the UN, and our agenda has to be aligned with that. It's already very, very good. I think this is a great progress that the current HE targets are already reflected in the Sustainable Development Goals, and we have 2 dedicated goals for biodiversity, SDG 14 and SDG 15, life on land, life on water. But then, of course, biodiversity is relevant for the food goal, for the water, for climate change, for many others. Cross-sectoral alignment, we already discussed a bit about mainstreaming and aligning with what's happening in the energy, in the infrastructure, think Belt and Road, massive, massive infrastructure development, the impact that that could have. How do we green that? How do we make that biodiversity friendly or neutral? They're all good questions. Another question is what happens to the HE targets? Because the HE targets technically have a life up to 2020. What do we do after 2020? Do we just discard them? Do we come up with new targets in Beijing? We call them Beijing targets. Or they remain because they were very well and thoroughly developed, I think, but 10 years is not enough time to really achieve such a massive transformation. So perhaps they can remain underneath and help us work towards a bigger framework. Pledges and voluntary contributions, that's something that worked very well for the Paris Agreement, where countries came and offered voluntary contributions against a global target, the 2-degree Celsius. A lot of discussion is, well, what's the 2 degrees equivalent for biodiversity? And we know we can't have a one single global target. And then strengthening accountability frameworks, indicators, reporting, stock taking, monitoring, all these things that are currently not very strong in the convention, I think need to be addressed in this first decade if we are serious. Shared burden for target contributions. If we set up targets at national level, it shouldn't be just the government reporting on this. It should be allowed, I think, just as it is in the Paris Agreement, that other stakeholders, and primarily the business community, but also civil society, can take actions that would be accounted for in terms of the national contribution to targets. And then mainstreaming and transformative actions, of course, because I think we need to get outside the bubble of conservation or being perceived as just scientists dealing with conservation, and being able to be seen as biodiversity and ecosystems and the natural capital being the foundation of life and development here. And then finally, resource mobilization, because whatever targets we'll come up with for post-2020, a critical question that would come up in negotiations would be, what are the means of implementation? What is the funding available for it? We know the convention has a financial mechanism in the Global Environmental Facility. There is an envelope there available for biodiversity, but that's a little drop in the ocean compared to the challenge. On the other hand, we know there is a lot of funding available that can be unlocked or mobilized, including private sector funds. So we tossed out the idea, maybe we can have a dedicated nature fund in a very innovative mechanism that it's not just ODA based, but it's blending private and public funds to support a real transformation in this agenda. So putting all this together, we come up with this little, I don't know how to call it, but he plus she equals we. 100 points for those who know how to decode it. He is, in fact, and you might be quite familiar with some of the thinking out there, that half of the Earth needs to be put under conservation. The half-Earth concept is coming from Professor E.O. Wilson, and it's a topic that has excited a lot of debate, pros and cons. And that's the 50%. She is the sustainable half-Earth. So not just conservation, us versus nature, but it's the whole sustainable use, the second objective of the convention, and where the transformation would need to happen. And that's to arrive at we, a whole Earth, in sustainable use. So just playing with some numbers here, if we give 50% target to half Earth, 50% to she, transformation, we will have, perhaps by 2050, a whole Earth that is sustainably used. But that first one, the half Earth 50%, is scaring many people because it's perceived as putting half of the Earth under conservation, and we know very well that that's completely unrealistic from a pragmatic political standpoint. But we don't have to think just about conservation. I think we could include the whole restoration agenda there, and a lot needs to happen in it. By the way, in the current plan, we have a 17% target on protected areas, terrestrial, and 10% marine. And chances are that by 2020, I'm almost done. By 2020, I told them I'm going to go over time because I get excited about this. By 2020, those targets would be met. So if we have 17% by 2020, can we dream to have 30% by 2030, 40% by 2040, and 50% by 2050? And including that conservation and restoration, so not to scare away people who still want to have sustainable development. Again, just some ideas. Yes. Right. So that was the what question, and now is the how question, because obviously the convention alone will not be able to inspire all of this or to actually make it happen. What we need is to create a movement with many other stakeholders. We need engagement, primarily of the business community, which I think the engagement should be beyond CSR, corporate social responsibility. The business community, just as we saw in the climate sphere, in the climate change, they took action when they saw a business interest, the profit-making opportunity. And the question that we are often asked is like, yeah, but what's the business model for biodiversity? Tell me, if I invest in this, what am I getting out of it from a business perspective? Not just because, I have a good heart and I care. And there is a lot of work, there are a lot of studies, there is a lot of data out there that could indicate the business-making opportunity. Science and technology, I'm not going to insist, we discussed about that. And then communication, branding, and narrative change. I'll start with branding, because we are the Convention on Biological Diversity. If you go, take my own country, Romania, and you walk on the street and say, hey, have you heard about the Convention on Biological Diversity? I can guarantee you 99% people would have never heard of it. If you go in many political environments, or even in the UN, and you ask the same question, they never heard of it. Let alone that some people, when they hear biological diversity, they think it's something with bio. So maybe it's bio-food or bio-cheese or bio-something, but not necessarily what we actually mean by biological diversity. So do we have a branding problem? Do we have, our terminology, our language for speaking to laymen is too complex, it's too scientific, and that's why we don't reach the hearts and minds and pockets of the people? And then the narrative change, the way we tend to communicate about biodiversity is from a very gloomy perspective. Sixth extinction, the curve, we're losing species at the rate never encountered before. But we don't spend so much time talking about the opportunities and the solutions, the positive messaging that biodiversity provides for climate change, for business, for all the other sustainable development goals. And I think That's essential, because if we don't do that, we're going to lose the battle. So the next steps for this between now and 2020, because we have 2 years to put some of these ideas into practice and hopefully have a successful agreement in China that will move us on this different path. By the way, there is so much, and some of the Chinese delegates are in the room here, and I know because I talked a lot with them, there is a lot of hype and excitement about China and the Beijing COP, and some people look at that as being the Paris moment for biodiversity. That's maybe true, but let's not forget Paris took many, many years to prepare, and it's a different agenda. We are not in a competition with climate change, and we have our own idiosyncrasies. So I think China should not be seen as the moment, the only moment. It's not the beginning of the road, and it's not the end of the road, but it's an important critical milestone on this road to 2050 and to transformation. Before China, though, we have Egypt in November, COP14, where we hope to already have some agreement on how to go forward. And then raising the profile, including the political profile of our agenda, is essential. The ministers of environment are not the most powerful ministers in a cabinet. You need the heads of states and you need the prime ministers to engage. And we saw the change. We saw when the president of Colombia personally committed to declaring more protected areas, things happen. And it's the case in so many other parts of the world. So that's very important. And I want us in the convention and all the parties to give some consideration to that. And finally, and I'm done, I just wanted, if there are a few words that I want to leave you with, is systems change, transformation, disruption, collaboration, and togetherness. We can only move this together, all of you here, us, our parties, because it's an agenda that is completely apolitical. It's about us surviving on this planet and thriving. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed, Christiana. Really inspiring, setting a perfect agenda for the rest of the afternoon. It's now a great pleasure to invite Richard Black to come and chair the panel discussion. Richard is the director of the Energy and Climate Intelligence Unit, which is a non-profit think tank based in London and formerly worked as the BBC's environment correspondent, amongst many other things. Richard,
brilliant.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mike. Pleasure to be here. Thank you. It's wonderful to be here. As Mike was saying, I run now a small think tank working on climate change and energy. We basically chose the most pompous title that we could think of for a tiny think tank. It's great fun. Because of this, I haven't really been heavily connected with the world of biodiversity and the United Nations since the Nagoya meeting in 2010, the last big COP, if you want to call it that, when I covered the whole thing for the BBC. And so it was interesting thinking back to that and the targets that came out of it, the sort of mainly a 10-year horizon looking ahead to 2020. The targets are great, but most of them are not being met. And I had a distinct feeling of déjà vu thinking about that, because 2 years before Nagoya, 2008, we had a set of targets and they weren't being met. And so what are we going to do this time? Do we want to go around this a third time? I would certainly hope that we don't, because all the evidence suggests that would not be a really, really good idea. So was communication tied up in what you might term, if you want to, the failure of those targets to deliver? Arguably, the big story on the block that was being pushed at the time was payment for ecosystem services. I failed to sell it within the BBC, let alone outside the BBC. We just didn't communicate that well. So are there things that can be learned from other bits of the UN system, from the Climate Convention, where the transition from Copenhagen to Paris was incredible, both in terms of the deal itself and in terms of all the communication that went around it? What about the Sustainable Development Goals? A lot of the MDGs were achieved, were communicated well, SDGs, looking pretty good. So what can be learned from there? What can be learned from business? Advertisers communicate pretty well. What about some of the new campaigning tools that are around, the new campaigning groups that are around that were not there back in 2010? So there's an awful lot that we can learn, I think, collectively from organisations and individuals outside the space of biological diversity. So I would like to invite onto the stage now, 5 people actually, who are going to share us their views, and will also be a chance for you to ask questions and for you to put some thoughts to us as well. The hashtag, if you will remember, is Our Nature, Our Future, so if you want to use that during the session, please do. Christiana, would you like to come back onto the stage at the far end? And then I'd also like to invite our 4 other guests, starting from, first of all, Alice J., who Alice is Campaigns Director for what is a relatively new kid on the campaigning block, Avaz, which I think has kind of rewritten the book, really, of how to do mobilization. Next, Patricia Zurita. Patricia is Chief Executive of BirdLife International, which is probably the largest sort of network, if you like, in civil society that connects conservation groups around the world. 120 organisations are members of BirdLife. Next, Prudence Gallagher, please. Prudence is Secretary General in the Ministry of Environment, Protection of Nature and Sustainable Development in Cameroon, and has led the Africa bloc in negotiations in the CBD, including in Nagoya. And finally, Helen Crowley. Helen is Head of Sustainable Sourcing Innovation at Caring Group. Now, if, like me, you hadn't heard of Caring Group beforehand, you'll have a clue in just how well Helen is dressed, because what we're talking about is clothing and fashion and some of the biggest high street brands. So the way this is going to work, 4 guests who you haven't heard from before will get a maximum of 5 minutes to make their pitch to you, and then we'll have some questions and answers. So the floor is yours.
The floor is mine. Thank you so much. And thank you very much for inviting me here. It's such a privilege to be here amongst you all and to be with the CCI group with whom we work, and also to sort of reflect on Nagoya too. I was there and it went fast. It's going fast, and I'm very happy to be part of this process to think, how are we going to do things differently? What I'd like to do, and just in the next few minutes, is just give you a little bit of an overview of what Caring does around biodiversity and business, and then I've got a couple of reflections on the work that has been done over the last few days and moving forward. So firstly, as well introduced me so well, Caring is a luxury brand, a luxury company that owns several brands, many brands, including ones like Gucci, Saint Laurent, Balenciaga. It is a company that is very, very committed to sustainability and has been for many years. It has a sustainability department in the corporate headquarters, which is where I sit. I'm in the sustainability department, so Head of Sustainable Sourcing Innovation is what exactly? I basically focus on raw materials. I focus on how do we source our materials in the most responsible and sustainable way. And that comes from, it's interesting that we have that focus, and it's important that we have that focus, and we're sort of a leader in the sector because of that focus. Because that is the interface with nature for our business. That is really where nature and business meet. We use biodiversity, we have impacts on biodiversity, and we depend on biodiversity. And the reason that we focus a lot of attention around that particular part of our supply chain, and we work all through the supply chain on other things as well, but my particular focus is on this area of the supply chain, is because we did something called an environment profit and loss account. It's a natural capital accounting methodology that was developed by one of our brands, Puma, and has now been taken across the entire company, and we report on it every year. It basically measures our impacts on nature, and it monetizes it as a construct to sort of talk about how we have how our impacts across different indicators vary. So you can look at it online. It's online, and you can see our environment profit and loss account. And it basically has shown that 93% of our impacts are in our supply chain, and up to 75% of our impacts are at raw materials. We're a luxury company, and we make beautiful, beautiful products. But at our base, we're an agricultural-based company. We're a forestry-based company. We're a mining-based company. And that's where we focus a lot of our attention. How do we do things better there? And that's what's been very exciting for our journey over the last few years, is looking at that type of impacts that we have, dependencies we have, and how can we do things better. And I'll give you a couple of examples in a minute.
In 1 minute, if you could, yes, please.
Yeah, in 1 minute. Oh, 1 minute, that went so
Yes,
quick,
indeed.
like since Nagoya, it's just
You've
going
got
so
it.
fast. Okay, so one of the things that I think is important, I'm actually a conservation biologist by training in the company, so this idea of how you communicate biodiversity and needs to the business sector is something that's very close to what I've been working on for 8 years. I think there are a couple of points that need to be. Relevance is number one. You have got to make it relevant to the business. We all love snow leopards, and we want to save snow leopards, and individuals in the company would love to do something for snow leopards. But how do you do it? You do it through cashmere, because they figure out that cashmere actually has impacts. There are impacts of cashmere production, and you can protect snow leopards by doing cashmere more sustainably. It's just a little example of make it really relevant for the business. And just to pick up on what Christiana said, make these scenarios clear for business. Build scenarios, build solutions and scenarios. Say, okay, if you do this, this is the sort of impact you can have. Make it clear, those targets, and relevant to the different business sectors, not just business, but fashion or luxury or agriculture. Make it very, very clear. And I think that scenarios and solutions are really important. And the clear targets, we're involved in science-based targets as well. We're involved in developing metrics for biodiversity. You do have to have those measurement metrics and tools. There can be a lot of science underneath them, but make them clear and relevant to the business so they can measure their progress as well.
Fantastic, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Prudence, from your experience in government and negotiations and so on, what ideas might you put forward about how we could do this better?
Thank you very much. I wear so many hats, and so it's quite confusing at times. Coming from, as the permanent secretary of the Ministry of Environment, and leading the African group in the negotiations that led to the adoption of the strategic plan and Aichi targets. You can imagine the big expectations in my mind. And the question is, how far have we gone with all of this? There is no doubt, because I look at this from different levels, that there have been major achievements after 2010 in terms of communication. And the main achievement was in terms of the way we communicated as biodiversity actors, both at the global and the local level. I think there was a major achievement that led to what we call the new generation NBSAPs that were developed and were very much aligned to the strategic plan and the Aichi targets, mobilizing many actors in the planning process, putting in place beautiful governance structures in that process. Yet, the big question remained, what has been the impact of all of this planning? And I think that's where the huge challenge for us as biodiversity actors has been, how do we get out of our box? We've looked at it, from global to national, but we fail to realize that there are many other processes that input at national level from intergovernmental processes, and what is the message they have been giving. And these have sometimes resulted in contradictory and conflicting sectoral processes, because that communication at global level with the intergovernmental processes and at national levels with our colleagues, we all went silo. And much as you meet in those coordination platforms, the knowledge, the information remains with the representatives, and the spill over to the key decision-making bodies in those sectors were not evident. We also found out that we were not communicating with the key sectors. We looked at the rural sectors, agriculture, tourism, fisheries, but we did not look at the sectors that had the overall mandates for planning, for mobilizing resources. And so the Ministry of Economy, Ministry of Finance, Planning did not appropriate the main planning tools that came out from this huge process of planning. And so implementation today, to us, is a key challenge. And how can communication resolve this? I think a lot of beautiful things have come out of the expert meeting, the discussions here, which imply that we are aware that we need to have messages that are packaged in a way that appeals to the non-biodiversity community. We need that. So where is the difficulty that we're not able to have this breakthrough within the last 10 years? And how do we address this as we join Christiana to plan the next framework for 2020 or post-2020? I think that's been the main discussion here.
About 1 minute, if you would.
I just would end up with the recommendations, the way forward in terms of packaging is we need to look at this at different scales. It is gonna be difficult even if you have one, there would be no one message that fits all. Even if you have one message, you need to package it based on the audience. And we must look at this at different scales. At the intergovernmental level, we need to get a message that is appealing to those other biodiversity-related as well as non-biodiversity community, and how this trickles down to the national level. We need to clearly move out to non-biodiversity planners. It's no longer planning, maybe move on to non-biodiversity implementing audiences, which involves a broad group of stakeholders at different scales. And I would round up very quickly. The issue of private sector has been a very interesting debate here. But we cannot, at the point where we are, develop a business or market model for biodiversity. Whether we develop it or we don't develop it, she's there already. Thank you very much.
Wonderful, thank you very much. I should say that tomorrow there's basically an all-day meeting here of communicators, and one of the purposes of this session is to get some challenges, to get those communicators really thinking and working hard. And I think you've given us one, Prudence, already, which is about taking a single coherent message, but then sort of repackaging it in ways that make sense for different audiences. Okay, Patricia.
Well, let me start by saying that I'm firstly honored to be in an all-women panel. It's great, and I love your graph of the he and she, because she is transformation. So, sorry, had to put that in. So I come from I lead BirdLife International, that is this amazing network of 120 organizations around the world. But I truly believe that we as the conservation community had failed to come together as one and make sure that the message of the crisis of biodiversity loss is clear to a much wider community than just ours. I think we're making some changes. I don't think we're there yet. And that's one of the reasons why I'm so proud of being here representing CCI, because we are a collaboration. We are proving that it's possible, and we are an initiative that brings us together to be stronger. And while the 10 of us that make CCI, and you have the logos behind me, are arguably different and have our own niches and spaces, by working together, we're proving that we can make things happen. And convening all of you here today is a proof of that. So we know it's possible, and we know it's possible not only within our community, but we can also reach out beyond our comfort zone, and I'm totally with you on that, Prudence. Now, for that, I think the message has to be, one, clear, it has to be engaging, and it has to be simple. Just about a year ago, we managed to dissuade the European Commission to rewrite the nature directives in Europe. And the Nature Alert campaign that BirdLife led with many other organizations worked, and it saved the directives in a record European Union consultation. We had 500,000 signatures of European and global citizens coming and defending the European nature legislation. And just to give you a context, the most successful consultation right before that was the TTIP, the trade agreement with the United States, with only 150,000 signatures. So it is possible. And I think the reason why this was successful is because, one, we worked together. It was not BirdLife or WWF or EEB. We were all together, 100 organizations all over the world, not only in Europe, mobilizing. Second, the message was simple. Nature was under attack. It needed to be defended. And the third, people had the power to take action. We gave them the chance to have the power to change things. And I actually argue that that's one of the reasons why the anti-plastic movement has been so powerful after Blue Planet, Sir David, if I may, because people have the feeling that they can have a change. So when thinking about post-2020 and leading into the beautiful 2050 vision, what we need to do is a couple of things. One, simplify the message. Biodiversity as a term is complicated. And I've told this to Tom Lovejoy. For those of you who don't know, Tom Lovejoy is the person who actually described biodiversity for the first time ever. It is a term that means everything, but at the same time leaves people completely perplexed. You know, my mom still doesn't understand it. So why don't we think about some other ways? Like, for example, picture the planet as your house, as your home. Nature is our home. It's not the garden in the yard that if you don't take care of it right now, you're just going to get the neighbor coming and knocking at the door. It is that house that is actually allowing you to put all the pieces that will provide the home, the space, the comfort, the safety that will allow you to survive. And you put all these different pieces together for the house to stand, including the light that goes through and the decor that you have chosen based on your background and your cultural traditions. And it is made out of multiple very complicated things. I mean, my father was a civil engineer, I will not go into this. And it's providing multiple services, contributing. I'm trying to look into, is that me? No.
No, definitely not.
Maybe. It's contributing to our well-being. And one species may be that break in that wall that if you actually pull out, it will collapse the whole top floor of the house. But the problem is that we have not gone to that point to actually defining biodiversity in a simple way where everybody actually understands it. We don't describe our houses as the pipes and the bricks and the tiles and the roof and this and that. We describe our house as a house, and everybody understands what it is. So we need to make it simple while acknowledging that biodiversity is complex, and that we don't want to lose that concept of complexity. Second, we need to be inspiring, and I cannot tell you how fortunate I feel of being in front of you as one of my heroes, because you do inspire people. But nature is inspiring. Nature is inspiring. Just thinking of these amazing birds that are doing this amazing migration of thousands of kilometers every single year is inspiring. So how do we use these to win more the hearts and souls, and I am totally with you, Sasha, pockets of the 7 billion that are around us? And I will always love what Sir David Attenborough, you said to President Obama in the White House. You have never found a child who's not owed by nature. So how do we harness that? How do we keep it going, not only in your young years, but going forward when you are actually older? While being inspiring, we need to enable people to feel that they can make a change. And I think the plastic, the nature directives, all these different examples, and you guys have amazing campaigns on that sense. We need to get regular people, not only the decision makers, not only the private sector. We need to talk to the people in the street, the people who are walking downstairs, the people, the parents of the children that are friends of my children in school, the people who are in the till in the supermarket, the decision makers, of course, as well. But we really need to create, and you said it, Christiana, a movement, a compelling and action-oriented movement. And not only of decision makers and private sector. We need to create a movement of, right now, 7 billion people going into 9. Now, the only way that we're going to be able to do this is collaborating. And this is a call to my fellow leaders of the conservation movement. We need to remember that we're working together for one single goal, one common goal. And that we have to come together, especially and particularly when we are addressing other audiences that are not ours. So imagine that all of us go together to the G7 or to Davos, and instead of presenting FFI and BirdLife and WCS and this and that, we are the conservation community coming and saying to all of these leaders, this is the way forward. This is what needs to happen. And yes, we all want to shine individually. I know that. Because the more that we shine, the more funding that we get, and funding is scarce. It's really scarce. But I am going to tell you something that I actually learned thanks to one of my fantastic supporters of BirdLife. There's about $380 billion a year given on charity. 380 billion, not million, billion with a B. Okay? Nature is getting about 1% of that. 1. So how do we actually change the hearts and souls of all these different people that have the power to change? And it's not only the decision makers and the rich governments. It's about, I'm almost done, to make sure that we can work together and make it happen. And going into tomorrow, not only collaborating amongst ourselves and having a single movement, but collaborating with the true communicators, the people who understand how to deliver these messages to the whole world. Not to us. We love talking to each other. We are really good and very comfortable in our space. We need to go beyond, and we need to use the people who understand communications in a much better way to actually make it happen and move the needle. So, thank you.
Thank you, Patricia. So, no big challenge there. Mobilise all 7 billion people around the world. We'll have that done. We'll have that done by 2020. Well, if any group can do that, probably Avaz. So, over to you, Alice.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you, everybody. For those of you that don't know, Avaz isn't a part of the conservation movement per se. We are attached to it, but it's in fact a movement of 46 million people in every country on Earth. And I think the interesting thing is what we found is that people do care. And people, people, when given the opportunity to take an action around a very specific moment where there's something they think they can do, they will do it. Millions of people have taken action through Avaz, whether it's about banning ivory, banning plastics, trying to ensure the survival of pollinators, or as alongside the 50%, nearly 1 million people have endorsed the idea that half of the planet should be protected. It isn't a question of people not caring. It is a question, in my opinion, of providing people with messages and moments for them to be able to galvanize around. We've just very recently, in order to understand where people stand right now, done a very quick poll, public opinion poll, in France and in Canada and in the UK. We asked a number of questions, but a few things that are interesting. Only about half say they are familiar with biodiversity. Mm-hmm. However, a large majority are concerned about the destruction of nature and the extinction of species by human activity. Over 80%. Over 80% want their governments to do more, and nearly 80% support the idea of setting aside 50% of the planet for the protection of nature. This is public opinion polling that's just been done. So we aren't in a situation where the public don't care. It's a matter of figuring out how do we convert that into action, and how do we convert that into what I believe is the most crucial part of this, which is political action. I think the first step is making clear that this is not just a crisis of species that we love and are in awe of, and nature that we revere, but we are testing the boundaries of our planet's ability to sustain us and all life on it. And that message is not making it up the systems of the ministries. It is not a head of state issue. And that, to me, is the absolutely number one priority. How do we make it a number one issue for the heads of state, like climate became? It could, in fact, surpass climate change, as we know. How do we make that clear, that we could cross ecological tipping points and threaten existence on this planet? We need to provide them with a sense that there's hope, not just that it's all catastrophe, but there are solutions, and that the solutions are available, and we need to make it clear and tangible in the messaging what those solutions are. Christiana put forward a very inspiring one today: he plus she equals we. This is something that's available and we should be putting out there, and that we want, and that people want, ambitious political action. The next thing is, I think we need to bring in the urgency of this. It isn't something that we can talk about and talk about and talk about. We need to move to action right now. So whether it's about a long-term goal for nature, or it's about securing marine protected areas right now, it's all of those moments along that spectrum, and focusing, campaigning, and work around making sure each of those moments are met. And I think that will come from and provide us with something that's even bigger than that, which is a sense of return to the possibility of multilateralism, which we're lacking. You know, that we can work together as peoples across this planet to ensure that we close the gap between the world we have and the world that we want, which is actually our mission. But to make sure that this crisis is an opportunity for us to return to live in harmony with nature, which allows us to have a connection in this very, very disconnected moment that we're living, and which is being encouraged by really diversive elements on this planet. I think it will provide us with a sense of purpose and unity, and most of it is about telling great stories, whether they're stories of reverence, as you say, and awe, or whether they're stories of emergency, or whether they're stories of serious crisis. That is what we need to get into the business of now, which is great storytelling. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Christiana, having listened to the four panelists, is there anything particular that you'd just like to pick up quickly? Anything you found useful, inspiring, that you hadn't thought of before?
Everything was very, very useful and inspiring, and I think I made my pitch already, and I took over time, so perhaps I will not say more now. But there are a couple of things, though, that I still want to pick on. The relevance not just for the business community, but as in fact all of you have mentioned, the relevance for the people and the relevance for the heads of state. How do we communicate this agenda so that people understand it's not an us versus them? How do we make it relevant that when you watch a National Geographic documentary and you see, or any other type of documentary, you see the baby elephant killed in Africa? What's the impact of a farmer in Ukraine on that? I mean, people watch, they cry, they say, oh my God, this is so sad, but it's not really affecting my everyday life. And there is a huge disconnect there to understand exactly what Alice was saying. This is about our survival. It's not just about species, and it's not about protected areas and national parks and taking your kids there on a nice holiday trip. It is about survival, and that message is not there. It's not in the political circles, it's not with the finance ministers as of yet. Yet there is great hope, because we have a lot of the work that has been percolating already with the natural capital accounting, with the biofin, etc. So those innovative, those little circles that I showed in my graphs are there. The question is, how do we get this transformation at scale, systemic, and get to the landscape? And in that, what we like to call acupuncture points? What are the points in this bigger ecosystem of actors and practices and cultures that if we press, we get this accelerated transformation? I don't have the answer, but I hope that we together can find the answer.
Just before we come to you guys, just a few things that I wanted to pick up. with our panelists from things that they've said. I mean, Patricia, you gave a very interesting example of that Nature Alert campaign, but you had a very simple ask there, and there was jeopardy there. There was a time, so if you don't do this, then something's bad going to happen. Is that really transferable to something like a global agreement on biodiversity?
I think so, and I think it goes back to what Alice was saying in terms of the urgency. You know, I think one of the reasons why the Nature Alert campaign was so successful was because we were in a time crunch. We knew that we needed to respond by certain date, otherwise the legislation will go awash. And I don't think we are, and I think, you know, I know that we're not in competition with the climate convention, but if I may, I think if anything, the climate movement has succeeded at putting the urgency very, very straightforward in front of people, where we have not succeeded at telling that if you actually take that brick out of the wall, the whole thing is going to collapse. And it, partly because it is complex, partly because it is complicated, and there's all this interconnection and we don't have a lot of information, but I think it's also because we are fragmented. I think we have to come together with one single cohesive message and say, it is urgent, it is now, and it is your future.
Yeah. Helen, I wanted to come back to something that Alice said. Alice was talking about hope. Now, hope is a kind of feel-good emotion. We like to have it. What you guys sell is also about feel-good. I'd imagine, I've never owned a Gucci thing myself, but I'd imagine that if you buy one and wear one, you'd probably feel good. You've got to sell, I don't know. Well, okay, good news. So, I mean, is there anything that from this whole sort of retail business you can pick up and advise people how to sell something hopeful and nice?
You know, yeah, I'm not a communications expert by any stretch. I'm a conservation biologist working in sustainability. So I can talk about, I think this idea that's been picked up, what I can talk about is how I sort of communicate more internally, if you like. What does sustainability mean for us as a company? And what is biodiversity? What does that mean to us? And I think there is that combination of creating a sense of wonder around how this is wonderful and touching people, but they want to know what they want to do. Like it's great to say there's urgency and it's nature it needs us, but you've got to give them a very clear call to action and a very clear pathway. This is what you can do. You can buy better, you can make better, you can do this. This is the certification here, or this is what we need to use in our supply chain, or we're going to use wildlife-friendly cashmere, or and give them very specific things and a way to measure their progress. So I think we do need. That was my relevance. I think it's the urgency and the storytelling is fantastic, but you also go, okay, what am I going to do? Do I give money to someone, or what am I going to do with my job? What am I going to do? What can I do to make this? So, help them out. This is all the experts here that know what needs to get done, but get very specific about that. I think that's the important thing.
Prudence, you were talking about what you considered a sort of failure to reach the really important bits of government, the finance ministry, the planning ministry. And this, to me, echoes loads of debates that have been held within the climate community over the last sort of 10 years. Have you had any successes there? Can you any examples you can point to where you have actually been able to go to the Prime Minister, the Finance Minister, and say, look, this is the issue, this is what you need to do for biodiversity?
Yes, I think that's the crux of the matter for the Ministry of Environment.
Yep.
How do you communicate to those key planning ministries? Of course, that would vary with the economies, with the different countries. But for a developing country as mine, where there is a paradox between the quest for transformation in a development pathway and the fact that we are a very rich, biodiversity-rich country, and you see the discussion move, you see the search, the planning, the global frameworks are defined by these key decision makers, and yet you need to communicate to them that all of it delivers on how you use biodiversity. We have discovered that we have to change the language. We need not talk, it is protection, it is conservation, that doesn't resonate to them. That they don't perceive it as a development issue.
Yeah.
You need to speak the development language. You need to speak the income generating language. They want to see what would create jobs. They want to see what would generate income. And so you don't go to the agriculture sector and say, you don't need to farm. But you need to tell them that you can't adopt farming methods and options that would make sure you farm for a longer time and generate benefits over a stretch of time. So what I'm saying is the message must relate to their interests.
Yeah, yeah.
It must relate to their preoccupation on how to convince the population that they deliver on improving their well-being. And so if you can't link biodiversity to human well-being, link biodiversity to economic development or growth, you would have a deficit.
And this is one thing that has happened, I think, fairly successfully in the climate change space, where obviously the Stern Review really put the economic impacts on. But now you also have, for example, in the UK, a health alliance on climate change made up of Royal Colleges of Medicine, Royal Colleges of Nursing, and so on, and all the great work that's been done in the US on security implications of climate change. So maybe there are lessons there, although climate change space clearly hasn't got all of the answers. And just finally, Alice, one point that you raised, I think that was implicit in the polling that you talked about, was the importance of language. People didn't necessarily know what biodiversity was, but yet they were worried about the loss of nature. And I was struck by the difference between those two words. Yeah. And I wonder whether this is actually one of the fundamental debates that needs to be had about the very word biodiversity.
I definitely think that there's a conversation to be had around what is the frame and what is the language that you use, without a doubt. I think that that's a part of it. But I also think it's more than how it's defined. I think it's about how we speak about the risks of inaction and the benefits of action. And having both of those frames out there, whether they're in economic terms or whether they're in spiritual terms, you know, both the risks and the benefits is where I think we need to go. And I want to emphasize, I think that there's a yearning, I think, from people to change their extractive relationship with nature. And so I do think there's a really strong place for what we call culture change or behavioral change campaigning around the use of plastics, around eating less meat, whatever it might be, but it's not going to be enough. And that actually we need to drive ambitious political action. But you can have them go hand in hand. So there's this sort of public behavioral change happening alongside the political action. In fact, the two mutually supporting each other.
Grand. So we have about half an hour. Love to hear your questions and your views. I would ask you to keep your interventions fairly short. I will cut off speeches. Sorry, I need to say this in a room where there's probably a lot of academics. And just a reminder that the hashtag Our Nature, Our Future. We have a couple of people with roving mics, so please put your hands in the air. Right, gentlemen, 4 rows back.
Look.
There, please.
Great.
Yeah.
Great. And straight up.
Thank you all very much. My question, and it's been mentioned a couple of times, is around youth. So how do we better communicate with youth, and to what extent should they be involved in shaping a post-2020 strategy, given that it is people like me who will likely be implementing decisions made in 2020 and beyond?
Fantastic. Who'd like to pick that up? Yes, Christiana.
I have some good news, in fact, because under the convention, one of our main stakeholders, it's a global youth alliance, and they're very involved. We engage them and they're very, very dynamic. I can't tell you exactly in how many countries they have chapters, but it's people that are present in all our formal processes, but also we engage them in these informal brainstorming discussions, because I believe that you will inherit the planet from us, and you have to be part of the conversation.
And who comes into that youth grouping? Is it self-selecting?
It's an alliance. I can give you, at the end of the meeting, I can give you the names and you can reach out to them. Yeah, it's one of very dynamic groups in the convention.
Fantastic. Who's got another question? Yes, about, just the rows that you're on there. Thank you.
Hi, just to pick up on the points that Prudence and also Helen were making about business. How do you convince business? The Equator Principles and the International Finance Corporation performance standards are now best practice. How can you convince governments to take them up to encourage investment? And also, as an example, how can we convince Chinese investors to consider that, because they don't speak much English generally?
Thank you. Which of you would like to pick up?
Okay, let me start with it. Okay. Yes, I think the discussions of the expert group within the last 2-3 days actually highlighted the key challenge in terms of engaging the business community. What is coming out clearly, and I was so pleased with your presentation, thank you. That's the private sector telling you we want to do it. We are already thinking about doing it. So you do have best practices that exist out there that want to do it. There are two questions. How are they doing it? Do we really have evidence of those good practices of business sector? We saw two categories of business sector you need to deal with. Those who to some extent have an understanding are doing it, and those who on the contrary want to impose the way they want to do it onto the governments and are rather eroding by way of through the way they exploit their resources, but yet want to dictate how they want to do it. So one of the approaches we identified is the governance around private sector, which means you need the public-private sector dialogue. Mm-hmm. And it is within the dialogue, based on your context, based on how you package the message, that would enable them collectively to identify the appropriate model or approach for private sector engagement. I think you need both actors. While the private sector needs to bring in the financing, the states need to provide an enabling environment, the incentives. And somebody said the trust, the confidence they have in each other, I think Christiana or someone raised that, would enable the private sector to partner with the public sector. To be honest, the willingness is there, both in the public sector and the private sector. My Prime Minister has been here in the UK in search of private sector to come invest in natural resource sectors. So there's the willingness, but it is the how. We know they are interested in their returns, the interest they make. That's the language they understand. But how do you dialogue and craft collectively a model which appeals to both the state and the private sector, as well as to conservation needs?
Brilliant. Thank you. Yes, another point, please. Yeah.
Thank you. A question for Helen, but I'd be interested in the other panelists' views. Firstly, to say it's obviously completely fantastic that you are taking all of these actions to make your supply chain more sustainable, and I completely applaud that. At the same time, you say that you are kind of a luxury brand, and the definition of a luxury brand being that some people can afford it, but most people can't afford the items that are being sold. And that's relying on economic inequality. And from all the panel discussion today, I think it's very clear that current levels of inequality are not compatible with both a good life for everyone and conserving nature. So how do you think luxury brands, high-end brands, how can you adapt to change or be changed to kind of make sure that everyone does have a good life and that we do still have some other species left?
I think our role as in luxury is to set example and to set trends. Luxury by definition is sort of a trendsetter for other brands. I think we need to show by doing on how to build better products. You don't have to. You can do it in luxury, but you can also do it in other sectors of fashion. It doesn't have to be luxury, but we can show how you can do it. Our responsibility is to do things really well and show how you can do that for other brands and for other people. And so I think that's our role in this sort of sustainability, as far as the sustainability piece goes. I think we have a relationship with biodiversity and quality natural materials that help us tell stories about the importance of biodiversity. So that gives us a special role as well. So I think we need to show by doing, we need to show governments, we need to show other brands, and we need to show other sectors, look, you can do this. It doesn't have to necessarily be a luxury product you create, but you can create a product with great standards all across the supply chain from the raw materials right through. And I think that's what we need to do.
What about for your customers? I mean, you can look at your supply chain and you can obviously have some influence there, but everyone who buys a product that comes from your group, that's an opportunity to interact with them. Mm-hmm. And I wonder whether you can use that in any way to further the cause of nature.
The way the brands talk about sustainability is something that the brands are doing themselves. And we at the corporate level talk a lot about the overarching principles and standards that we put in place for the brands. So the way the brands engage with their consumer is very much a brand-specific endeavour. But we do talk a lot at the corporate level about our commitments and show people this is what we're standing for as a group.
Christiana, are you getting the interaction that you would like with the business community?
Yeah, yes. We have, in fact, in the convention space, we have at each of our conventions, so in Egypt, but also the previous ones, we have a business forum. We have a global business and biodiversity platform where a lot of the businesses come together to showcase their good practices. But frankly, I think there is a lot more that has to be done. And in the climate change, we did see, and it was interesting, somebody was telling me the other day, the Paris succeeded not because of the governments, but in spite of the governments. Mm-hmm. And it was all the other stakeholders, the civil society engagement, the grassroots, the business community that drove that success. So I think this is a fantastic window of opportunity between now and 2020 and beyond to in fact scale up the engagement of business. And I insist beyond CSR. I think what you're doing, it's really good. But I look at business not only as those who bring in the finance, but those who also bring in the innovation, the disruption, the opportunity seeking. And they can be the agents of change for the broader society. So I think maybe between now and 2020, one idea that we had and we'll have to discuss with our partners, with our members as well, our parties, perhaps it's time to have a big global business and biodiversity summit or an event where we bring the businesses from all these industries that we talk about, the agriculture, the forestry, the fisheries, now mining, health, huge subject, manufacturing, bring them together to showcase their best practices and inspire the others so we can get further change.
The Paris Agreement also had the Pope, of course. Mustn't forget him. Yes, over there.
Leadership. My question is really about the difficulty between short-termism and long-termism. You've been talking about timeframes of 2020, but all the way out to 2050. And I wondered if, from all your perspectives, you could perhaps reflect from a policy making through to business decision making, where we know the timeframes are really quite short term. We're talking 6 months to 3 years, really. And when we're talking about things like restoration, transformation, multi-sector, multi-stakeholder engagement, that takes time. And when we want to see results, those are going to take even longer. So I just wondered if you could reflect on how we can move away from planning to implementation, but satisfying the requirement to see some firm results.
This is a question that I was wondering myself as well when I was looking at your presentation. Christiana, would you like to have a first bash?
Yeah, well, I think this is the greatest challenge we have, because we feel that, if we put all our bets on the COP15 in China in 2 years, and I think we also need to manage our expectations, because we won't be able in 2 years' time to get all these massive changes, transformations, etc. But I think if in China we are able to set the framework for this more systemic shift type transformation, that's already going to be a good success. The reason I wanted to look at it with a long-term frame, it's because we have the vision there, and that's inspiring. But again, I think we need to attach some measurement to that vision by 2050, so we know if we are on the right path to get there. And then be very specific to what we try to achieve between 2020 and 2030. And there are a number of things that I already listed, which are things that right now in the convention are not very strong: the accountability, the monitoring, the indicators. And I think Prudence made a great point, again, coming from the government. Implementation. The current strategic plan and the 2080 targets were fabulous conceptually, and a lot of work went into that. But it's very hard to implement. So after 2020, we need to find a way that it's easy for the ministers and the governments to really get down to action. Otherwise, I think the risk is that we will get lost in the bureaucracy machinery, trying to update our plans and our strategies. And by the way, our countries have national biodiversity strategy and action plan, national climate change strategy and action plan, national development plans, and a long list of strategies and plans that in fact not always talk to each other. So a key challenge is, how do we get at the national level a sort of whole of government approach? How do we break the silos at national level? But the inspiration could come also from the global level.
Alice, when you're listening to 2030, 2050 plans, targets, I mean, with the campaigners head on, what are you thinking about how you transform that into something that you can actually get people interested in?
I actually think people do rally and galvanise around, we saw it with Paris, around long-term goals. So I do think people can see it, specifically if you have something that's a sort of ratchet and review, so it's 30 by 30, 40 by 40, right. 50 by 50. It's something measurable, tangible, that both the public and the politicians can get their heads around. I do think, however, that as a crucial part of keeping it going is having things that are tangible coming up now. So I was saying, like, there's 2 big decisions to be made this year about marine protected areas. We need to win those. We need to ensure that neonicotinoids are banned in Europe this year. We need to do all of these ongoing campaigns that are going to ensure, both with the SHE part of it, the sustainable half-earth, so that's the farming and the fishing, and as well as the protected areas. And I think one feeds the other. The more you can do the immediate campaigning and people see that it works, they see that their action has results in policy, the more you can engage them on the longer term stuff. So that's the way we would do it.
Great. There's a hand up at the back, I think.
Yeah, hi. Do the panel see any tension between the kind of messaging that could motivate the business community about accentuating the profit-making possibilities afforded by the natural world, and the kind of messaging that would create that groundswell of popular movement that Patricia was talking about, which may be more about making people feel emotionally, spiritually connected to the natural world and seeing it as a moral imperative, therefore to conserve it? Is there any tension between those 2 ways of messaging conservation?
Patricia.
I think Prudence said this very eloquently, and messages have to be targeted to different audiences. And I think it is a complementary message here. I mean, while you are actually enabling businesses or governments to understand much better what the crisis is and why we need to take action now and what that 30% means and what that 40% means and what the 50% means. And you do that, you then give quick gains to, bigger groups of people, not necessarily at the decision-making level, but more at the regular people level, what I was saying before. If I can get the parents of the school of my children to actually mobilize in favor of putting bird feeders in the school, like those type of things. It's like the minute that you start seeing those small actions turning into reality, you start igniting people. And I think that's exactly what has happened with the plastic movement right now. I mean, I don't know if you guys saw, but I think it was last weekend, customers at a Tesco in this very country decided to start taking all of the plastic and giving it back to Tesco so they can actually take care of it. And that is mobilization and that is action. And when people have the opportunity to take action and they feel that they have won something, then we can create that global movement that is actually pushing the government and the private sector so we can actually get there. I think it's complementary. There is a tension, of course, because the languages are going to be different, but it is the same message going towards the same goal.
I think that's interesting. And it's interesting that applies very much in a UK context at the moment around climate change also, because we are seeing emissions coming down year on year, and actually we're not getting any poorer because of it. So that has definitely encouraged a new narrative from the government. I think there's another hand up in the same neck of the auditorium.
So I wanted to ask, if you look at the issues that you raised, Christiana, in your talk, one of the things that I didn't see in there that I think is really important to figure out how to deal with is the illegal wildlife trade. And I say that because, for example, the illegal timber trade is $50 to $150 billion. That's all of the habitat we're talking about for the biodiversity. We see IUU fishing, $50 billion, illegal wildlife trade, $20 billion. These are enormously increasing problems, and the problem with that is that it has so much corruption and immorality involved. So you're talking about a lot of optimism, getting people to feel guilty about using their resources, et cetera. Well, these people are independent of those issues. So how do we bring that in, given that now it is causing almost more damage than habitat loss?
Thank you. Yes, Christiana, do you want to have a quick go at that, and then Prudence, perhaps?
Yes, very, very, very good point. I think, in a way, yes, I'm trying to stay optimistic because otherwise I think we have many reasons to be very pessimistic. And I had in the principle slide, I had one little line about dreaming and visioning, yet being realistic and pragmatic. I didn't want to put the word corruption in there, but that's a huge problem for many countries, developing countries, perhaps developed countries alike. I know better the story in developing countries, and it's a cancer, and it's people that are cynical, and for which perhaps indeed what we talk about here would mean nothing. They would just laugh at it. So it is our challenge to find messages or measures to address that as well with this kind of people. And of course the law enforcement, it's important, but many times the law enforcement, it's also tainted by corruption. So for the illegal wildlife trade specifically, there is the CITES Convention, so it's our sister complementary biodiversity convention, and that's their primary focus. We collaborate a lot with them, but the question of corruption has to be addressed somehow.
Yes, maybe just to add on to that, I come from a highly rich biodiversity community that has had huge investments in conservation for decades. But the picture sounds so gloomy, but I think there is a positive entry point into this. And I'm happy the conservation community is here. There's been a dramatic change in the approach of the conservation community, which created room for a lot of this to happen. Initially, the conservation option was in exclusion of the community. In fact, communities were moved out of protected areas, and in some communities, they attempted to relocate them in other ecosystems. It was a dramatic failure. But the new approaches that have been adopted, and I think there is no other way to go than on that pathway, is to involve communities in protected area management. And when you involve communities, not only does the issue of their being part of the benefit appeal to them, but they will play a better role than law enforcement officers, whom you have rightly said some are corrupt and are actually part of the complicity that leads to the huge violations in wildlife you've talked about. So in as much as riparian communities are part of conservation, protected area management, I think we will get to a situation where you can reduce illegal wildlife trade significantly.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Gentleman right down here.
Pick up on a point, if this is working, that many of the panelists raised, and that's that messages don't necessarily resonate with other communities, whether that's business or finance. And I want to share an anecdote very briefly and a suggestion for this communication session tomorrow. So I work for a team within UN Environment that looks at sustainable finance, and we ran a project trying to understand how people perceive risk in palm oil supply chains. And one of the elements of this project was to scrub Twitter for words that different communities associate with risk. And the basic grouping was civil society and the business community, who ostensibly were the target group whose behavior they were trying to change. And when we ranked the key words, the top word from civil society was orangutan, and then it was forests and sustainability and trees. And we then looked at the business community, whose behavior these tweets were trying to affect. The key word was derivative, as in derivatives of palm oil. But then it was profit, revenue, supply chain, et cetera, et cetera. So the practical suggestion is, and there's also a question here, is if that resonates with anyone on the panel, but technology is such that the cost of doing this is actually relatively low. So as a practical suggestion for your discussion tomorrow, could we just do this in whatever lens you choose? It's pretty low cost, it's pretty easy to do, pick any language, and just build the empirical body of evidence to see if the language different communities are using actually resonates with the target audience.
Fantastic idea. Anyone like to just have a quick comment on that? Alice, Patricia, maybe?
I think we all agree.
Yeah, we all agree. Best suggestion of the day. Right, a lady right on on that back corner. Thanks. Yeah, just to your right, yeah. This is going to have to be the last question, I'm afraid. So.
All right, well, I hope it'll be of interest. So I was also in Nagoya, and I've been thinking what has changed in the global landscape that can be helping us thinking about the way forward. And I think one major change is that the interrelationship and interdependence between biodiversity and human rights is so much clearer now than it used to be. And I think from a legal perspective that is very powerful, because it tells us that conservation and sustainable use are not just a matter for the people in this room, but they have to do with the rights of the children, with everybody's right to health, with our political and civil rights. So I'm just wondering if the panelists may reflect as to whether they think human rights language may be a powerful communication tool as well, and can it be equally powerful for the different audiences we're looking at, for governments as opposed to business, as opposed to the general public?
Prudence, would you have any thoughts on that, human rights language?
Well, very quickly, I would have asked you the question, has human rights itself had a language that cuts across, all the different legal regimes? I would have asked that. It is a challenge, and I think the message we're giving from this panel is you need to understand your target audience. If human rights, which undoubtedly you can look at resource rights as human rights issues, but the particular audience you're dealing with, if human rights is appealing, that's the entry point. But if human rights is not the appealing language, especially if you get into non-democratic systems and you use human rights, I wonder how you're going to communicate with them. So what we're saying is, what is your entry point? You need to identify that with the governments, with the private sector, with the various stakeholders and use the language that appeals to them most. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, I mentioned at the beginning that there was going to be a little question, a final question for each of you, which is basically the challenge that you would set for the round table of communication brains who are going to spend tomorrow basically thrashing through some of the issues that we heard. And if possible, I'd like each of you just to give in just about 10 seconds, if you could, what you, the thing that you would like to tomorrow's communicators to come up with that you think is most necessary, that isn't there at the moment in terms of how we communicate nature. That could be a messaging thing, it could be an audiences thing, whatever it is. You think the biggest challenge?
The biggest challenge,
yep.
or the challenge for the group tomorrow?
For the group tomorrow, yeah.
Okay, so I think that I'm going to pick up on the language.
Yep.
I think the message, be coherent about the same message for everybody, but use the right language and words for the different audiences. And that includes not just business, but it also includes what you're going to ask individuals to do.
Thank you. Prudence?
I call it packaging.
Yeah.
Packaging is absolutely important for any message you want to give out. I'm sorry I may give two messages. I come from a developing community, and you need to package the message that speaks to development. How will the developing, economies, promote growth, development, human well-being, alleviate poverty, link your packaging to the big challenge of development in developing countries.
Thank you so much, Patricia.
I think the biggest challenge is what do we replace biodiversity with?
Yes.
Because people understand nature, the garden in the garden in my yard, or the Amazon forest. So how do we by simplifying the message and the complexity of biodiversity to something that is a lot more appealing, how do we make sure that we don't lose the complexity of what biodiversity really means?
Thank you, Alex.
I think the challenge is how do we, in the next 2 years, make biodiversity and the crisis of biodiversity an issue that puts people into government or takes them out of government. It is an electable issue.
Fantastic. Christiana?
I had the same thing. How do you make it politically costly for those in power so they can't continue to ignore this.
Great. Well, I'm looking forward to tomorrow even more than I was before. Can I ask you to put your hands together for our fantastic panel? Now, it won't surprise you to learn that many groups in the environment and conservation community have already been thinking about this communication challenge, and one that has been doing so is WWF. The ask there basically is to come up with something that can create a global movement that will have resonance with the public, with politicians, with business as we approach 2020, and indeed with the rest of civil society as well. Something that will lead to an approach that puts nature at the centre of decision making, a kind of reframing of nature, biodiversity, as something that's at the centre of our well-being and security, that speaks to responsibility to conserve nature, but also the opportunities that creates, and some of the solutions that are in the space already. So there's just a little snapshot coming up now of some material that's been prepared by WWF. Looking forward to 2020.
Few realise that saving our planet is within reach. We have worked out the problems, and we are working on the solutions. We have just enough time and a unique opportunity to change course. The plan is obvious. Stop doing the stupid stuff. Keep hold of the natural wealth we still have, and finally build the stable, healthy world which we can benefit from forever. This opportunity is in sight, but we need to stop being blinkered by the demands of here and now. This must change if we are to change. In 2020, our world leaders will gather to make decisions that impact every one of us. But this time, we will all be watching. So if enough of us can see the path ahead, we may just start down it in time.
Can I thank WWF and Netflix for giving us that, allowing us to show that preview, and encourage you all to watch the full series as soon as it's available. May I add my thanks to Richard for chairing, and to the panel for being so incredibly inspiring and giving us cause for real hope and ideas for how we better communicate. Talking of communication, please now join me in welcoming one of the finest communicators on earth, a man who's inspired millions by sharing his own passion for life on earth. Ladies and gentlemen, Sir David Attenborough.
Thank you. I hardly know what to say, really. I was, three-quarters of a century ago, I was an undergraduate here. I was here because I've been, for as long as I can remember, like I suspect every single one of you, fascinated by the natural world. It didn't occur to me to think whether that was important or significant or anything much, except that it was the one thing that I needed to know about. I don't think I heard the word conservation used once in 1946. And perhaps there wasn't the problem, there certainly wasn't the problem the dimensions that it is now. A lot has happened since then. One of the things that's happened, of course, is that the population of the planet is 3 times greater than it was then. 3 times now greater than it was then. So there wasn't the sort of problems, nor was our technological capacity anything like as powerful as it is now. A vast change. What I've been hearing and what I know and what you all know, the size, the dimension of the problem has grown beyond all measure and all imagination from what it was 75 years ago. There is one further thing that has changed since then, and that, of course, is the way in which the people of the world communicate to one another. I joined television, BBC, in 1952, when only a tiny proportion of the people of this country could see television. The only programs came from Alexandra Palace in North London and could only be seen in the London area. Now, of course, everybody, rich and poor, can see television. So we have a mechanism that is at our disposal, if we know how to use it, to bring the sort of problems that you have been discussing in front of the people who can do something about it. That is to say, people, ordinary people. How we're going to do that, I don't know. We're having a go, we're having a try. Netflix is preparing a series of programs right now on the problems that face this planet, which will be available to everybody and for a very long time around the world. That is one thing. In a certain way, that's the easiest thing, because I'm sure we have to produce subjects that will appeal to everybody around the world, in every continent of the world. So we will be dealing with the things that speak immediately to people. I don't have to list them to you. You know them very well. The glories, the splendors, the marvels of the planet. And you only have to say that that's in danger. Then you will recruit support. Of course you will. But as the small sample of I've been listening to this afternoon makes absolutely patently clear, transparently clear, and depressingly clear, the problems are enormous and they're also varied, and there is no single solution. Every country, every community will have their own problems and their own solutions. As I said, just listening to you talking with such insight and such passion and such knowledge makes me proud that this university has this institution and that it's able to marshal this sort of intelligence and knowledge and insight. There are no simple solutions to these problems. There are solutions to some of them problems, but there are no solutions, single solutions to them all. Looking back, though, 75 years, of course, there has never been no simple solution produced over those years. And of course, the problems have increased beyond imagination. But while there are people like you putting your heads together, people like you getting together and spending time together, it does seem to me, as an onlooker, that the world has a cause for optimism and a cause for gratitude. The problems are indeed increasing, but the solutions are there. And I wish you every success in your conversations and debates and arguments that will lead to China, to Peking, and every success, my goodness, every success for the deliberations that take place there, because the world desperately needs what you're doing. I wish you every success.
Thank you very much indeed, David, and thank you for your continued support, inspiration, and sharing your name with this wonderful building and initiative. It only remains for me to thank you all for coming and joining, and especially those who joined via live streaming rather than being in the room. And please, if you've enjoyed this, if you've been inspired by it, which I'm sure every one of you has, go forth, collaborate, communicate, keep it simple, keep it positive, but make it urgent. Thank you very much indeed.